I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I'm going to be your chair for today. Now, the obvious prompt for this session is the midterms coming up on November the 8th. America's first chance to put their thumbs up or thumbs down on the Biden administration. And you might remember when, around the time that Biden was elected, he was kind of seen as a possibly mollifying figure. Maybe he was going to calm things down after the outrageous and brash Donald Trump. I think it's fair to say things haven't quite worked out like that. So that's what we're going to be discussing for the next hour and a half or so. We've got a fantastic panel here for you today. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. So to your left, we've got Jack Garland from the University of California, Los Angeles. Then we've got Yaron Brook, chair of the Ayn Rand Institute. Then we have Richard Johnson, who is a lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University. And finally, Helen Searls, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Feature Story News. That's enough from me. I'm going to give my panel 5 minutes each, and then we want to hear from you and what you think is going on. Okay, Jack, do you want to get us off?
All right, so we're talking about the midterms and the culture wars in the US, and if the United States can maintain its role as a preeminent power, as a world leader, despite the culture wars and despite the polarization happening. So Americans care about domestic issues. It's really hard to get American voters to care about foreign affairs. And so the number one issue on everyone's mind right now is inflation. And that spans Democrats, Republicans, Independents. It's more prominent among Republicans as their main issue compared to Democrats. But everyone's top issue right now is inflation. And then, like every midterm, this midterm election will be a referendum on the president, Joe Biden. And so apart from inflation and a referendum on Biden, we now move to the more social, cultural issues. But there's a very important distinction between cultural issues and cultural war issues. So cultural war issues are issues where policies aren't proposed, ideas aren't proposed, just grievances listed. It's not trying to convince people of an idea or of a policy. It's just trying to rile up their base and enrage the other side. And so the number one cultural issue right now is abortion. And there's some legitimate debates around abortion with real policy implications and a lot of room in the middle, a lot more than it may seem, to make some compromises. But the Democrats and the Republicans are both exploiting this issue to make it a cultural war. And so on the left, we have Joe Biden tweeting recently that a vote for Democrats is a vote to make Roe v. Wade law, which is not that simple. With that statement, he's trying to get Democrats excited and get them to the polls. And on the right, we have Lindsey Graham proposing a bill that bans abortion nationwide, which breaks from the Republican ranks and goes against the Republican idea that abortion should be a state's issue. His proposed bill, he knows, will never pass, at least not in the next few years. And it's just meant to get Republicans excited, pro-life Republicans especially, and once again, get them to the polls. And then Democrats and Republicans both have their kind of pet projects, their pet cultural war issues that they push, once again, to get their voters out to the polls. So the Republicans in the last few weeks have ramped up attacks on Democrats for being soft on crime and for allowing crime to happen and run rampant throughout cities. They're not really proposing any policies except for the very general funding of the police. And then on the right, or on the left, they're very concerned about the January 6th committee right now and what issues or what recommendations they might bring forward in the coming weeks. And they are not trying to reach Republicans or reach independents by talking about January 6th and talking about Donald Trump. They're just trying to get another attempt to bash Trump and to get their base excited. So moving on to America's role as a world leader. Trump recently proposed a peace deal, or peace talks, between Ukraine and Russia. And he actually suggested that he could moderate these peace talks. So that breaks obviously with American policy and with Ukrainian policy. And I think it's safe to suggest that he and his candidates that he's supporting in the midterms are less supportive of Ukraine in their fight against Russia. But at the same time, Senate Minority Leader Republican Mitch McConnell is one of Ukraine's most ardent supporters. So it's hard to say that more Republicans in Congress would result in less support for Ukraine. I think in the short term, even if some Trump Republicans win their elections, support for Ukraine will be steady from America. And Biden right now is, Biden and Democrats, there's a bit of a shift from past years. They are coming out more supportive of Ukraine. But like I said earlier, I don't think this election will change how much support Ukraine has gotten from the US. So to answer the main question of this session, can the US lead amidst all this polarization? It did it. It's done it before. It's done it this last year. It did it with a bill promoting semiconductors and chip manufacturing in the US as opposed to in China. And it did it when Congress rallied around Democrat Speaker Pelosi when she visited Taiwan. And then most importantly, it's done it 3 times in 3 separate bills since March, providing support humanitarianly and militarily to Ukraine to the amount of about $65 billion. So no matter the result of the election, the U.S. will continue to be a world leader because politicians understand the responsibility the U.S. has. In the long term, however, there's a possibility America retreats from the world stage. But this won't be because culture wars have destroyed us from within, causing our GDP and our military might to decline. Americans on the right and on the left in 2022 don't care as much as they did during the Cold War or even in the last 20 years about America being the world's lone superpower. Thank you.
Thank you. It's hard for me to see that. I think America is going through a real crisis, a crisis of identity, a crisis of trying to figure out what it is, what it stands for, what it actually represents. For a very long time, the ideas at the founding of America, the ideas that made America what it is, I think the greatest country in human history, I know that might not be popular in this audience, the freest country by many measures, and certainly the most powerful economically and militarily in human history. The ideas that made that America possible have been in decline now for decades. One could argue even a century. And that decline has reached a real pivot point. It is now a reality that nobody in the political spectrum in the United States represents what were the ideals that made America great, to the extent that America was. I mean, it's kind of funny that Donald Trump had this term of make America great again when Donald Trump has no concept of what America is or what actually made America great to begin with, and that's part of why he failed so miserably. There's no political voice today for, if you will, the founding fathers of America. There's no voice today for the concept of individual rights, for the concept of freedom, for the concept of liberty in the United States. There is a struggle and a battle between a left and a right on who will control our lives and in what way that control will manifest itself. One of the striking things about this midterm election is that while the economy will dominate, yes, I agree, that this is going to be determined, that the Republicans will probably win, certainly in the House, possibly even in the Senate, primarily because the economy is doing so badly under Joe Biden. The absurdity of that is that nothing would have been different if Republicans were running things right now. Indeed, many of the inflationary pressures that exist today were caused by Donald Trump's policy of writing massive checks to everybody, bailing everybody out during COVID, and generally increasing government spending throughout all 4 years of his administration. Indeed, Donald Trump argued for an infrastructure bill far, far greater than anything Joe Biden actually passed. Indeed, one of the things that is true globally today, and true, you see, you're living in it right now in the UK, that there is a complete consensus about economics between left and right. Truss tries to cut taxes a little bit, tries maybe to bring in a little bit of markets into the UK political establishment, and she gets crushed for even proposing such a preposterous idea of maybe cutting the top marginal tax rate of 45%, which makes imminent sense as you go into a recession, to cut the top marginal tax rate if you care about economic growth ultimately. But she can't defend it, because the consensus among the people, the consensus among intellectuals, the consensus among everybody is we need big government involvement in the economy. And that is true in the UK, and that is true in the United States, and that is true in Europe. There's complete consensus about economic issues. We're all way to the left of center on economics. Everybody is. Even Truss now, Liz Truss has been brought to her knees Now she is going to be left of center on economic issues. So what's the difference between the Republicans and Democrats? What is the battle about? The battle is about cultural issues. That's how left and right are defining themselves. And to a large degree, that is true of the United Kingdom as well. Here, the big difference between the left and the right, to a large extent, is around these cultural issues. The popularity of Boris Johnson in the last election was not due to his revolutionary economic plans. It was due to his nationalism and his conservative cultural views, while shifting left on everything economic. And we're seeing that in the United States, exactly the same phenomena. We're seeing the cultural issues as defining the two political parties. The cultural war is defining the war between the two political parties. Economics, in a sense, is irrelevant. Economic outcome might be relevant, that is the swing based on how the economy is doing. But economic policy of the Biden administration and the Trump administration is almost identical. There's almost no differentiation, and I would venture that whether you vote for Labor, whether you vote conservative, in the short run at least, there's going to be very little difference in terms of economic policy. Thank you.
Richard. Is this on? Can you hear me?
No. There's a red light should come on. There you go.
Okay. I want to use my time to reflect on the first 2 years of the Biden presidency. A week before the US presidential election in 2020, Joe Biden visited a sleepy town in Georgia called Warm Springs. Warm Springs has a population of about 500. It's closer to Alabama than it is to Atlanta. And in a tight presidential election, visiting such a place that is not particularly vote-rich is an unusual move. But Biden was going there because the symbolic significance of Warm Springs, because in the 1920s to 1940s, the most famous president of Warm Springs was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Joe Biden is the only US president to have been born during Roosevelt's presidency, 12-year presidency. It's interesting he's the only one to have been born during it. And for Biden, Roosevelt is something of a political hero. Biden decided to put the portrait of Roosevelt in the Oval Office where Obama had once put Abraham Lincoln, Donald Trump had once put Andrew Jackson. Biden wanted to draw the comparison in two respects. One was the scale of the challenge that he was facing, drawing the comparison with the Great Depression and the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis the United States was facing as a result, and also the scale of ambition. Now, in both respects, Biden was being somewhat hyperbolic, but to campaign in poetry, and perhaps he was taking a bit of poetic license there. I think to take an honest assessment of the Biden presidency is to say that Biden has had a consequential and a reasonably legislatively successful first 2 years. This is in some ways partly down to Georgia, which helped give him the presidency and also gave him control of the Senate. But Biden also has key challenges that Roosevelt himself might recognize. He faces a divided party. So did Roosevelt. Roosevelt's New Deal was not the program that Roosevelt himself might have wanted. It was a compromise he had to reach with the Southern Democratic faction of his party. Sometimes the New Deal is described as a compromise between Sweden and South Africa. Biden himself has a divided party between the sort of left Justice Democrats, Black Lives Matter wing of the party, the more moderate Blue Dog wing of the party. And also Biden, and again this is something that Roosevelt might recognize, faces an intransigent Supreme Court, and a court that does threaten to constrain elements of his agenda, and certainly to put certain questions back into politics lately that had been taken off the agenda. That being said, I think there's some interesting continuities also to think about between Biden and Trump. I think that Biden has, in foreign policy terms, there's been greater continuity than change, I think there. I think particularly when it comes to China, I think Biden is a China hawk. He may not express his words in the same way as Trump in terms of the substance of the US policy towards China. Not that much has changed. On trade, Biden emphasizes a Made in America agenda. On the border, Biden has not really reversed a great deal of Trump's restrictions at the border. I think this means that Biden is in some ways a unique figure within the Democratic Party, someone who has the capability to pull this off in a highly divided party. In spite of the severe weakness, of course, is his age and concerns about that. But in many ways, I think the bigger risk would be to try and replace him with someone else for the next election, given it's not clear that anyone else of the next generation can really hold the Democratic Party together. I think that Donald Trump is likely to be the Republican nominee. I think he will be an effective campaigner, and Biden really is in for the fight of his life. But I think that Biden has been able to thread the needle on some of these real difficult issues the Democratic Party itself is battling itself with in important ways. And the final point I'll say is, of course, that the elephant in the room is the Supreme Court. And in some ways, liberals are reaping what they sowed by an over-reliance on the court and the weak political foundations of some of the objectives that they wanted, relying on a court that can be a fickle mistress. So,
Helen.
Okay, so I work in the news business, and when we started thinking about the coverage of the midterm elections back in the spring, it all looked fairly predictable. Usually midterm elections are a referendum. Oh, sorry. Usually the referendums are just the midterm elections are a referendum on government. The economy was doing badly, and it just looked fairly predictably as though it would be a Republican sweep, that they would take the House, they would take the Senate. There would be a real dissatisfaction with gas prices at $5 a gallon, which I know is not very high for Britain, but that's astronomical for us. You know, that was kind of what you thought was going to happen. But I think the interesting thing is that whereas that is on everybody's mind, inflation hasn't actually become the issue that people think it is in the election, because as you said, quite rightly say, there is no debate about how to deal with inflation. I mean, it's just kind of this act of God, and people are pissed off, and so they're anti-government, but it doesn't really work itself out in policy. And the only policy that seems to be you know, effective at the moment is to export our inflation by having a strong dollar. I mean, that's kind of almost the only thing that's happening. But when you looked at what the issues were in the spring, it was very much the culture issues of school choice. You know, we planned a whole kind of series of packages, news packages that we were going to do on school boards and school elections and school choice, because it seemed as though, you know, the culture war was unfolding, and school choice was going to be a very important issue in this upcoming election, and it would be the stick that Republicans could use to beat the kind of woke Democrats very effectively. But what's kind of thrown a spanner in the works in this particular political climate is actually abortion. The abortion issue, I think, has changed the culture wars in quite an interesting way. Abortion traditionally in America was used as a stick for the for the Republicans to get their vote out. It was something that was always a way to rally the troops, to get to the party faithful, to get the vote out. And so it was seen as an issue that would favour Republicans. With the Dobbs decision and the decision to throw out Roe v. Wade, and then the subsequent election in Kansas, I think that issue has changed dramatically. That what's happened is that and it took everybody by surprise. The right felt that they had an issue that they could really win on, and this was, and it's fantastic, and they had a majority on the court. This was like their wet dream, if you like, of what was going to happen. But it's really kind of backfired, and I think now there is a genuine debate about abortion, which even the left are really not in a position to take charge of, because if you look at the sort of pro-choice organizations in America, they kind of put abortion very much on a back burner. They thought it was either a settled issue or that they had to talk about abortion in a much more kind of woke way of talking about pregnant people and chest feeding and all this kind of stuff was what was dominating the left thinking. So now you actually have ordinary people who would like access to abortion now saying that this is one of the key issues in the election, and I think it will not necessarily mean that the Republicans will not win the House. I think the Republicans will win the House, but I'm not entirely sure they'll win it by the thumping majority that they thought they were going to win it by. And I think that if you look at the Senate, it's also going to be quite a challenge, I think, for the Republicans to win the Senate. I mean, they ought to win it, given what's going on in the world and given the kind of popular kind of policies that they could put forward at the beginning. But I think abortion has thrown a spanner in the works for them, because ordinary women need abortions, and so young women, suburban mums, that kind of key voting element of the public have got kind of caught up in a cultural issue which previously worked in a different way, and now suddenly is getting people to come out and vote. And we'll have to see how effective it is, but I do think it has changed the landscape a little bit.
Thanks very much. Okay, so now it's your turn to make your points, get out your questions. Have we got some mics going around? Yeah, can we get a mic to this guy there? And if there's another one, can we get it over here? Oh, okay. Right. Up there. Has anyone got a question upstairs?
Yes. Hi. Hello. My name's Garland, based in Budapest.
Sorry, could you stand up, please, for the camera?
Oh, I'll probably hit my head if I stand up. Well, even that's good. All right. Hello. My name's Garland. Around the state of America right now, it seems to me that there are two sides, right? There's been sort of, you call it the Trumpy side and the sort of wokey side. But it seems that both sides look at the other and say the other is the pathology and they're the cure, and vice versa. But it seems to me that both sides are symptomatic of a deeper pathology that is shared, that is in need of a cure. And I wonder to what extent there is a failure on both sides to diagnose properly what is the problem. And in the history of medicine, people often mistreated things, because they misdiagnose it, they confuse the symptom with the pathology. Now are we collectively, left and right, misdiagnosing the nature of the problems that ail us? It seems to me, whether you are left or right, whether you are the sort of the woke people who have very literal use of language, or the sort of nationalist people who have very figurative use of language, or the people on the left who are looking to a utopian future, or the people on the right looking to a sort of halcyon past, whatever the differences are, they both seem to be very dissatisfied with the present. And I wonder whose interests are being served by everyone fighting with each other. It seems to me that you have a sort of neoliberal context where you've seen social media emerge, where the money is being made by dividing and ruling, of turning each side against each other. Because whether you are someone in so-called flyover country suffering an opioid epidemic or having a job shift overseas, or you're someone who's 25 living in New York City where you can't afford your rent, you're both being screwed over by the same thing. And yet they hate each other. So I'm wondering, is there a failure to diagnose the problems that ail us? Thank you.
Thanks. Is that him?
No, yeah. So the issue of, I guess, what people besides call threats to democracy has become an incredibly major issue. I was a journalist in 2020 in Pennsylvania. I covered the election there, and there were a lot of attempts and shenanigans by the Trump side to overturn the vote in Pennsylvania. And of course, now there's the prospect that if some of these Pennsylvania Republicans get in, they could try doing the same thing again. But also you have, of course, that election was overshadowed by the censorship of Hunter Biden's laptop, really on behalf of Democrat-oriented technology companies. And as sort of like this suburban battle that's pitching up, I know that book banning and other cultural issues have become a major thing in the schools, but then also we have the abortion issue. So this very important target demographic of suburban women, I guess, like just to ask them all the panel, like, are both parties are more, is either party or side, in your view, more of a threat to democracy? If not, why not? And similarly, like, what way, given all the different things, do you think this key demographic bloc will trend in my home state?
Lady behind you there.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask you a question.
You stand up for the camera, please.
About Yaron, you made the point about the that nobody is standing up for the sort of ideas of the founder. I was really interested from a UK perspective, thinking about the gun control laws. I'd really like to hear what you think about that, because it all seems slightly astonishing to me. I mean, well, you know, we've had like one school shooting in this country, and straight away our gun laws have changed. But the sort of resilience of the gun lobby. And is that, I suppose my question is there something actually quite positive about that? Or is it just another sort of culture war issue? It feels to me that there maybe is something intrinsically positive about people's sort of sticking with people's resilience and sticking with that idea about the right to bear arms.
John, there.
Yes, looking at America from Britain, you know, it's kind of a strange thing. We, I think the viewpoint that we're given is that, you know, Trump is pretty much an idiot and so on, and has to be stopped, and that's the view from Britain. So really my question is that, you know, I'm looking at it from my own point of view. I don't share the British point of view on this. It looks to me as if the state in America is attempting to delegitimize Trump, prevent him running in 2024 with all the January 6 hearings and so on, and also his effective censorship once he ceased to be president, or even before the end of that presidency, he was censored on social media. It does appear, you know, is there such a thing that we recognise as the deep state, which is looking to promote purely the democratic side?
Can we get the mic up to this gentleman here, and then to the very front? We'll come back to
Yes, I just wanted to raise the issue, going back to the title, Can America Survive? Because I want to ask the panel what possible impact the so-called cultural wars will have on America's economic and financial state. Because I can't see that the issue about abortion is going to have any direct impact on business, but I could see that movements like BLM would have impact on the economy. The thing is that at the moment, you know, America seems to have given up its military role worldwide, but it's still well ahead economically and financially, and it's going to take some time for China to actually catch up. So I want to see how much effect these cultural wars are going to have.
And right in front here, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Looking at both sides, on the Republican side, to what extent will Trump keep his grip on the GOP? Do you see that changing in the near future, given his age? Or do you think his services to science for this has changed? On the Democratic side, Trump, the reason Biden was a candidate, in a sense, well, he's the only mainstream guy we've got, not really excited what's happening. Really came in fact, he probably achieved more than we expected him to do. What do you see as the future on the Democrats? Have they got anyone like Biden who sort of could unify the party? It seems to me it's lacking, the next generation is lacking.
Helen, I thought I'd come to you first. There's a few different questions around sort of democracy, question of delegitimising our opponents. So obviously, Trump famously denies the 2020 election result. He's running a platform on that. But also you have Biden calling his opponents semi-fascists. You know, this general sense that the other side is not legitimate and not to be engaged with. How do you think that that could play out in these midterms?
I think that's, sorry, right this time. I think that is very much how American politics are at the moment, that essentially people are, the strongest card each party has is demonizing the other side. So for Democrats, what's going to get the vote out for them is to demonize Trump and to basically say, you know, we've got to remove Trump's candidates, and you know, he's the problem, and if we can make the whole election about Trump, then that can kind of cover over a multitude of sins that we're not particularly dealing with problems. And then similarly for the Republicans, I think they would like this to be a referendum on Biden, and they see Biden and the woke left as the problem. And I think what that means is that what I think the danger of the culture war is, and I think this is it may not seem to sort of work out at the level of Ukraine, but I think you can see increasingly, is the division within America. I think it's becoming a much more fractured and divided society. I mean, there's even kind of moments when you think, you know, would Texas, you know, split off, but obviously it can't. Austin is in the middle of Texas, which is one of the most liberal cities there is. It's not just a state by state, but the sort of the big sort of people just living with people that they agree with, and the divide between rural and cities, the divide between the you know, the coasts and what you call the flyover states. I think that division is incredibly damaging for America, because it means that there is now no consensus in any kind of way about what it really means to be American. And I think that's where the division, I think it's dangerous. I think it leads to a kind of a chaos which is, you know, unpredictable. And I think that is a problem. I think the interesting thing on some of the points about democracy, I was just going to come back on that, was that it's traditionally, you know, you think, oh, well, in America, you always think that the GOP gerrymander their, and actually the Democrats gerrymander their kind of boundaries so that they can elect their own. One of the interesting things about this election is the general consensus is this is going to be the least influenced by gerrymandering. It's actually quite a fair division at the moment. It probably won't stay like that, but it is quite fair. So I think what we actually see now, you know, that one issue I think is not on the table in terms of restricting voting rights in the way that people have talked about that before. So I was just going to put that out there.
New York Times recently did a piece on, you know, congratulating the Democrats on doing enough gerrymandering to even things out.
Yeah.
Such is the craziness of it. Richard, anything you want to respond to?
Yeah, so I think one thing to say is that, you know, the notion of a culture war in the United States is not new. I mean, famously, Pat Buchanan declared at the 1992 Republican Convention that there was a culture war. And really a sense of sharp battles in American politics over questions of identity and social issues throughout the post-war period can be found in the battles over education integration, battles over involvement in the United States in the Vietnam War, the abortion debate obviously, also debates over school prayer, more latterly same-sex marriage and so on. Right? So these are not, it's not that the United States has suddenly discovered the culture war. It takes on different forms. I suppose in one sense perhaps that's maybe going back to the original question of the panel, that could be a sense, a source of some assurance that the United States trundles along throughout history, even with these within these battles. On the threats to democracy, I think this is perhaps an area that is newer and might be cause for concern. Of course, there have always been voices at certain elections that have questioned the outcomes. Going back to the 2000 election, there were certainly some Democrats who didn't think that the election had been properly allocated to George W. Bush, and some Democratic members of the House objected to the certification of electoral college votes in 2000, and a few more in 2004 over controversies over Ohio. Of course, Stacey Abrams in Georgia famously refused to concede, losing the governor's race a few years ago. I think this is on what we're seeing in terms of the denial of the 2020 presidential election by Donald Trump and some of his supporters, and it is on a different level and scale, and I am concerned about how this is becoming a litmus test in many ways within the Republican Party, and a vital element of democracy is losers' consent, and perhaps both sides to different degrees have not fully subscribed to that in the past, but it seems to be really fading now, and I think that's a big concern.
Yeah, I wanted to put this woman's point to you. She's talking about, Americans, still ordinary Americans, if not their politicians, still are very in favour of their right to bear arms. I mean, to give another example, a lot of them in certain states didn't tolerate lockdown, not going to tolerate the government bossing them about. Isn't there some optimism there to be found?
No.
No?
Not for me, anyway. No, I mean, the very idea that there were lockdowns in the United States of America is so horrific that, yes, about a year after the lockdowns were started, a few people rose up and protested over it. But the very idea that Americans, Democrats, Republicans, anybody, would allow the state to lock them down over a virus is so shadowy that it turned me from an optimist to a pessimist about America, because I couldn't imagine. If you told me that there was going to be a virus that primarily kills old people, right? It does, but keeps the young people pretty much safe. That we would lock down the entire society. We would lock down everybody and lock them at home, and that Americans would just shrug and go, "Fine, that's okay." And maybe a year later they would remember, oh, maybe we have some liberties, and maybe we have some freedoms, and maybe we should object. It's just, I would have never predicted that, and indeed the CDC never predicted it, and it's why in not a single plan that the CDC had prepared in advance for pandemics was ever a lockdown ever considered. And in that sense, the West didn't use the CDC manual, they used the Communist Party of China's manual to deal with pandemics. We all became China, like that. China has won the cultural battle, like that. We're economically moving towards China, and we dealt with the pandemic like China. And it's I know this is not a popular view in Europe, but that's pretty horrific. The fact that our individual liberties can be taken away by the government like that, by scaremongering us into our homes. And look, I'm not a denier of COVID. I'm vaccinated fully, at least 3. I haven't done my 4th one yet. I'm not a denier that this was an awful virus, but this is like the worst way to deal with it possible. And the fact that of all the individual rights that Americans possess, the one that they are most adamant about is that they can hold on to their M16s is not inspiring me. If they held on to their First Amendment as strongly as they hold on to those M16s, I would be a lot more inspired. But you're seeing an attack on the First Amendment, a dramatic attack on freedom of speech. And again, we're way ahead of you guys, because you guys have hate speech laws and things that violate free speech right off the bat. But in the United States, we're seeing it both on the left and the right. Clearly, Donald Trump was egregiously hostile towards freedom of speech, to the extent of going after Jeff Bezos because he owned the Washington Post, because the Washington Post wrote the story that was negative towards Donald Trump. The left, with its wokeness and its cancel culture, clearly does not believe in freedom of speech. There was a real attack on freedom of speech in the United States today, and I wish Americans will be holding on to that. I think, and not to mention separation of state and religion, which I think brings us back maybe to abortion, which there's no particularly strong, powerful constituency to hold on to that. The left would like to impose their kind of religion on us, and the right would like to impose their kind of religion on us. but impose religion on us, both parties want to do.
Jack, is there anything there you'd like to respond to?
Yeah,
from the audience.
Yeah, I'm going to try to hit on everything from the audience, but really quick about the COVID.
How does that fit into the cultural way? I guess is that being useful way?
Yeah, well, first off, China is still in these lockdowns, and most U.S. states were out of lockdowns within about 2 months. So I think that's the biggest difference there. But so I want to touch on everything. So to the guns real quick. So the Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. And the reason you don't see, one of the reasons you don't see big gun reform after these mass shootings, which are uniquely American and have causes from mental health to media sensationalism, and you could go into that. But it's law-abiding gun owners who don't want to be punished for these one-off psychos, which I'm a little sympathetic toward. Now, assault rifles, that's a whole other question. So that's the Second Amendment. The Third Amendment is that the government is not allowed to quarter soldiers in your home. So that just gives you a little sense on, yes, the Bill of Rights is great, but you know, it's not like everything in it is worth defending to your death. And then with the election and election deniers, there was a poll recently that 1/3 of Republicans would like their candidate to concede if they're to lose. So only 1/3 of people think, 1/3 of Republicans think that their candidate should concede if they lose, and about half of the Democrats. So that just shows you where faith in elections is diminishing, and that's probably the biggest point I'm pessimistic about in the future. Also, in these midterms, a lot of people don't realize that there are a lot of state elections too, so governor races, Secretary of State for states, they have elections coming up, and those Secretary of States for each state are in charge of administering elections. And there are, I think, about a dozen Trump-backed Secretary of State candidates who have said explicitly that they would not certify their state's results if they had the same sort of anti-Trump results in 2020. So that, I think, is concerning. Let's see. The military, I would push back on the fact that the U.S. military is in decline. It's still, I think, second most allocated item in budget. Some almost $900 billion a year goes to our military. And like I said earlier, we have $65 billion worth of funding to Ukraine. I think about 40 or 45 of that is military. And the javelins and other equipment have proven really successful. We have long-range missile defense systems on the way. Let's see. For the Democrats, for the Biden successor, I don't think there's a clear person for who that would be. It's not Kamala Harris. She's very unpopular. People will suggest Pete Buttigieg, who's the current transportation secretary. Before he was transportation secretary, he was the mayor of the third largest state in Indiana. So he doesn't have many credentials. I think most likely is that Biden will make a decision around the first of the year if he's going to run again. And if he's not going to run again, there'll probably be an open primary.
The governor of California.
Yeah, Newsom. He has a little bit more credentials, but again, I mean, he'll probably run. We'll see. And then with Trump, I think his fate depends on his candidates in the midterms. So if his candidates do well, I think he'll run. If they don't do well, he might run still, but I think we'll have a lot less clout in the Republican Party. And just real quick, it's also totally abnormal for a failed presidential candidate to still have this much power of his party. It's ridiculous. Mitch McConnell, since January 6th, has distanced himself completely from Trump. I don't think they've spoken at all. Kevin McCarthy condemned him on January 7th, and then about a month later was down in Mar-a-Lago talking to Trump. And he is in line to be the Speaker of the House if Republicans are to win. Let's see.
We can go and we'll come back.
Okay, all right, yeah, that's okay.
Okay, let's go out to the audience. Go out to the audience again. There's a couple of things I'm conscious we haven't quite touched on yet. Things like crime, Black Lives Matter, the climate, another big culture war issue, even though people pretend it's about science. But then, right there. Have we got two mics down here and one upstairs? Okay, so let's have this person. Sorry, this person here, and then you with your hand up upstairs, and then we should bring it down.
Yeah, just a quick question on the culture war debate, because I haven't completely got my head around it, because on the one hand I can see that the way that it's presently constituted is enormously divisive, and that is enormously problematic. I completely, get that and understand that. But obviously, one reaction might be, okay, let's just all be friends and ignore this stuff, which I don't think works. I mean, isn't the paradox that in a way we need a kind of culture war on different kinds of issues? So, for example, rather than having identity politics, we need some kind of national politics we're framed within an American national framework. We need a culture war. You mentioned Yaron free speech. It would be good to have a culture war on free speech, a pro-free speech culture war. On the climate thing that Fraser mentioned, to say, well, in fact, what we really need is economic prosperity. We're overly concerned about the climate. We do need to wage a culture war on prosperity. So, am I right in thinking that per se, a culture war is not a bad thing, but we need to have it on the right issues with the aim of uniting the population rather than just dividing it unnecessarily?
And yeah, upstairs.
Just a quick one. Ray Dalio recently said we put the odds of civil war at 30%. Someone like Tim Pool, he's probably going to put a number on it, which is probably a near certainty. Where do you sit on that scale?
Likelihood of civil war? Interesting. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I've heard Americans speak about civil war. I mean, I walked the Camino in Spain, I met a few Americans. A couple of them talked about civil war. I thought that was a bit exaggerated myself, but what I see is, have we reached a peak woke? You know, I mean, basically, we seem to have reached peak woke in this country. The apology of Rupert Hunt over what she said about superficial rights towards Johnson. And the response of the Labour Party, which was to say, yes, this is racism, and we must oppose it, immediately challenges the most extreme interpretations of critical race theory. And so that line has been drawn now. That's the Labour Party's first response to that. The Conservative Party's already been responding to it with legislation over trans rights, or trans legislation, and also which might imagine might be Conservative supporters amongst football fans who challenge the kneeling at football matches. So we've reached peak woke. It's obvious that our authorities have realised this is the case. Maybe the Americans have also realised this is the case. If so, what's the alternative? I mean, it seems that wokeness was a response to the way that liberal democracy didn't actually work as it was planned to. It didn't cope with what was going on after the Second World War and the 1960s, and coping with the official racism that they had. But that's changed now, and the situation has changed, even though we've got Donald Trump. So, is the way back, going back towards the Constitution, going back towards the American Constitution and liberal democracy, and ultimately religion, because these are the unifying factors in social life? Or is there any more scope for more wokeness and more individuality and more isolation and atomization? I'd just like to ask you all.
Can you pass it behind you?
I was wondering, recently there was a picture on social media of Kanye West wearing a White Lives Matter t-shirt, I think it was, and I was wondering what you thought the role of like celebrities and sort of like, I don't know, popular Twitter discourse was. I don't know if that's just a thing of like people in my generation or like Gen Z millennials, but in terms of cultural war, I think that's like a very similar catalyst, basically. So I don't know what you thought about that.
Do we have the woman there with her hand up? Further back there? Yeah? Waiting. Oh yeah, go on.
Okay. I wanted to ask if you think it's possible to reach a consensus in the society regarding the economic issue of inflation and of the role of the government and the size of the state. And if you think it's possible, which would be the best and most effective way.
And can we pass the mic back to the woman there, and someone has the mic up there, is that right? Yeah, John, speak now.
I don't honestly see how the US can avoid civil war, to be perfectly honest. I know it's much of a trendy thing, but it has been obvious for a while that there are two
Americas, and these two Americas cannot coexist. Either America is a country of freedom founded on the principles of revolution, or it is a white supremacist project that exists on the back of slavery. These two idealizations of America cannot coexist. And the way to negotiate any chance of them coexisting is rapidly breaking down, as we are seeing with the delegitimization of democratic processes. My question is, how could any of you see a way forward that does not involve mass violence?
Yeah, lady there.
Just a very quick one. Is this the "we hate Donald Trump" panel?
Jack, I'm going to start with you. Easy question. Okay. Civil War.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the last one. So I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump. He had some policies that that actually, even on the international stage, definitely led the U.S. and I would say the world. He was big on having other NATO countries increase their spending. He brought the Democrats along with him, opposing China. I would say since January 6th, since he told his Attorney General, his White House counsel, many of his aides, and about dozens actually of federal judges that they were wrong and that he actually had won. That's when I got to the point where I don't want this guy close to politics ever again. And back, like kind of to piggyback on that, with the Civil War question, I think Civil War would be more likely with Trump back in the White House or running again in 2024 as a Republican nominee. Because obviously, if he loses in 2024, assuming that he runs against a Democrat in the general election, he will not accept the results. And I think that he'll encourage his supporters, similar to how he did in 2020, to not accept them at any cost. And I think that's where it gets dangerous. Outside of Trump, I don't think that the U.S. is close to civil war. It's kind of interesting to talk about, but I don't think that I don't think that you would have these large armed factions going against each other. Like I mentioned kind of earlier in my opening, there's a lot more consensus in Congress than people realize. Take just the infrastructure package, for example. Like I said, the aid to Ukraine, even the COVID bills, which was overspending, but at least it was bipartisan overspending. I think the media sensationalizes everything that happens in the U.S. politics, and the extremes, the progressive Democrats and the Trump Republicans, are made to represent the right and the left, which is not the case. In reality, they represent about 15% each of the electorate, which is surely a minority. And I think Biden's presidency, while I don't agree with all his policies, represents a more moderated version of American politics, and a version of American politics where civil war is not possible.
Yeah, I mean, is it worth thinking about the fact that most Americans are surely not diehard Trumpistas or blue-haired woke horrors either, and probably not going to want to pick up a gun to defend either of those positions. Well, aren't most people normal and have normal, idiosyncratic views on a range of issues?
Definitely, people are normal. Most people are normal, and the fact that we color these states red and blue. But in every red state, there are big pockets of blue, and in every blue state, there are big pockets of red. And a civil war is not between the states because, as somebody said, Austin, Texas, which is in many regards kind of the heart of Texas, is very, very blue, right? It's very, very democratic. So the civil war would be within the states. It wouldn't be across the states. I don't see much prospects for civil war because I will say, with regard to the scary part is that such a large percentage of Republicans who support Trump are, willing to reject the election, right? Are willing to overthrow an election in order to bring him back to power. That is the one. With Trump out of the equation, I agree, civil war is very unlikely. On the other hand, not to be too optimistic here. On the other hand, I think American decline is inevitable. That is, I do think America is declining, and this relates to the question about cultural war relating to economics. I think it certainly does, because I think the cultural war distracts from the fact that America is in decline economically. Economic growth in America, everybody cheered when Donald Trump said we had the greatest economy in history because we grow at 2% a year. Pathetic is all I can say about that. American economy is in decline, and the only good thing one could say is the Chinese economy is in decline even more so, right? So I think global economy is going to be troubled for the next few decades. And again, this is all kind of distracting from the real challenge which we face, which you mentioned regarding the Civil War, which is, what is America? Is America the principles of liberty and freedom and individual liberty and so on, which is supposedly one side? I'm not sure which side, because I don't think that is represented at all in the American political map today. Or is America woke? Or is America, as what's her name, the congresswoman from Georgia said, is America a Christian nation? Fundamentally Christian. So you've got tribalism on the one side, left tribalism and right tribalism on the one side, which is Democrats and Republicans both are now tribal and collectivistic and anti-American Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I, by the way, would be willing to fight to the death for the Bill of Rights. It's important. Yes, you might find one aspect of it to be irrelevant, but there are a number of aspects there that keep the country alive and keep, I think, Western civilization going. But both those aspects, both left and right today, are tribal. And there is no representative on the political map today, or on the cultural map, not just the political map, the cultural map, for the individualism represented by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. There's no representative for the kind of individualism represented even by somebody who I consider relatively mediocre, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan could not win in the Republican Party today, and that is a travesty. Now, Ronald Reagan's not my ideal, right, but he's sure is better than anybody else in the Republican Party right now.
What about Kanye West has been suggested?
Oh yeah, let me just say something about Kanye West.
Unifier.
I mean, Kanye West, it's sad because I think Kanye West has real mental problems. No, this is not funny. I'm not meaning this as a joke. This is documented. He's got bipolar or whatever it is. The guy is mentally not there. And the fact that we idolize him and put him on a pedestal does not help his mental problems. It would be good if he got treatment and we didn't worship him. I think generally, who the hell cares what a singer, as good as he might be, I don't get him, but as good as he might be, thinks about anything? Why do we care about what singers and movie actors or sports figures think about politics? They're irrelevant to the political debate. I mean, they're relevant because people admire them above and beyond anything reasonable. But, they are not shaping the world. What's shaping the world are the intellectuals. What is shaping the world are the professors at universities and public pundits, and even the politicians don't shape the world. They're just, in a sense, they're just mouthpieces for the intellectuals behind them. So if you want somebody to object to, and if you want guidance, it's always been the intellectuals. That's where it comes from. And these celebrities, I couldn't care less what any of them said. It would be great if some of them said something rational and reasonable. That would be nice. But given that they're almost always, whatever side they happen to be on the political map, unreasonable and completely, completely nuts, why would I care?
Richard, I mean, one of the sort of themes that's been coming up is that there are areas of you have consensus in Congress over big economic issues. The Supreme Court, obviously, not elected. In fact, at odds with majority of opinion on the big issue of abortion. I mean, does that contribute, do you think, to the kind of tenor of the culture wars, the sort of the rage that is often behind it, the fact that people feel that they actually can't influence anything?
Yes, two points there. I think first is to say that Biden has attempted to, in terms of his legislative agenda, has tried to keep a lot of these social issues and cultural war questions out of his legislative agenda. And part of that is because of the reality of the narrowness of his majorities in Congress. Added to that with the filibuster, that for most pieces of legislation, Biden would need 10 Republican senators to agree to anything that he put through law. The exception there is with certain finance bills, which he uses this reconciliation process through, and that's how he's pushed through some major spending bills. Now, I don't think there is consensus on these things because every single Republican voted against Biden's last major spending bill. So there's that, and in a way, I suppose, as someone, I'm generally a critic of anti-majoritarian rules like the filibuster. The filibuster, in some ways, does limit the ability of either side, really, to push contentious legislation through. And I think in some ways it's a bad thing for America, because I think you put things through, and then you have an election to hold people accountable for whether or not that was a good decision or not. The core has been a long-running way of taking certain issues out of the political system, and the abortion one is obviously the most salient and fascinating in many ways, where basically Roe v. Wade allowed Republican legislators to use to pass laws that were highly restrictive on abortion, that spoke to their core constituency, in core Republican primary voters, knowing that these laws would not go into effect because they were contrary to the Supreme Court decision, and yet get the credit in the primary election. I suppose in a way what we have now is now the decision has returned the abortion question back to the states, and in some cases these laws have now been triggered into effect. These legislators are the dog that caught the car. And I think it's going to be very interesting because about a third of Republican voters believe in access to abortion in some form, and yet 0% of Republicans in the House and just 2 Republicans in the Senate are pro-choice in any form. And so I think there will be a battle now within the Republican Party in a way that there hadn't been before on the question of abortion. I'll be fascinated to see how that goes.
I was going to try and look at a couple of positive things that I can think about America. I think that a lot of Americans have a great sense of their rights, and I think it is a rights-driven society, and I think that then sets up certain quite interesting kind of happenings, which I think we can be quite positive about. I do think that the resistance of certain parents to having a school curriculum that was, very much governed by critical race theory, in that happened. I mean, I think there's a lot of weird stuff said about critical race theory, but I think the fact that parents felt that they wanted to have control over what their kids were doing, I think is a very American response, that you feel that you have parental rights, you have authority over your children, and in that sense, there are some really great things about America, which is that when you kind of take away their rights, people do react, and I think it isn't just a kind of woke thing. So I think there are areas for positiveness. I see the same thing on abortion. I think it's like the kind of debate in politics about abortion was one thing, but I think that young women think they have the right to have an abortion, and they feel that that is a right, and it's something that is worth trying to fight on. And in fact, they've not even been mobilized for so long precisely because it's taken out of their control. And I think that, in fact, the fact that young women, my daughter, is outraged. She says they're treating me like a vessel. I mean, she's like, her friends are just really do not feel that their autonomy should be taken away from them. And that may be the same sentiment that makes people hang on to guns. I think it is that sort of sense that you have certain rights, and being an American means that you have certain rights. And so I think that's a very positive thing about America. I think I wanted to come in on this peak woke thing, though. This is a bit more negative. I think that the woke agenda in America is very much driven by identity politics, and I think that while you have people who see themselves as autonomous and having rights, and at the same time you have an obsession with identity, the self, a sort of narcissistic way of looking at things. And I think that all I can see is identity politics spreading. I think, in many ways, the way that the MAGA people talk about being white is almost like becomes another identity. It's not just that, it's colleges, campuses, and all of that, where people are thinking about identity. I think that in every kind of sphere of life, it's not like there's people who are immune to it. And so I think that when you have that dominance of identity culture, and it really is ingrained in American culture, it does obviously divide people up because you get divided around your identity. And I think it means that the sort of, it may not be called woke, it may be called something else, but I think that sort of sense that we're vulnerable, we're victims, we have to look after our identity, we don't share things. I think that's the flip side of it. I think there's an intrinsic sense of people wanting to, don't like their rights being taken away, but on the other hand, there is a growth of identity politics, which I think will mean that whatever it's called, wokeness or whatever, is got quite a way to go.
Okay, let's have some more audience questions. There's someone right at the back. Who the hell set that off? We've still got another 20 minutes to go. They're not kicking us out. Yeah, that person there. Yeah, woman there.
A variation on the Civil War.
Can you stand up so that the camera can see you?
Yeah, so a variation on the question of the Civil War thing. I saw a poll a publication of a poll back in the 2020 elections where 40% or so of Republicans said they would want to secede if, I think it was in California, if Democrats won, and a similar number of Democrats would want to secede if the Republicans, Trump won. I wondered just where secessionist movements were they on the up and the down, more or less where they've always been. And I just wondered also if you'd comment on a comment I recently heard, I think it was Douglas Murray, the Spectator, or someone like that, said that in his view now, American politics was mostly about just inflicting maximum pain on the other side.
These secession polls sound a bit like those celebrities who said they were going to leave when leave the country. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Up there, you've got a question?
Yes, I'd like to ask the panel. When I watch Joe Biden speak, he, obviously there's clips about him. It doesn't seem like he's all there.
Sure, yeah. Understatement,
yeah. And I just wonder. It doesn't fill me with confidence with all the issues that we have in the world right now. And then if I look at his number 2, Kamala Harris, she's even more ridiculous. I've listened to her talk and she also doesn't make any sense. And I just want to find out, does Biden actually have a lot of influence with the decisions that the way America's going? And on Trump, with him not conceding to the election, I'm not saying I sympathize with him, but I just wondered if I was him, and I see when the emails of Hillary Clinton happened, there was no investigation there. When Joe Biden's laptop came out, it was just completely censored. And I just wondered, him and his supporters, especially when you see it on the news media, they get sensationalized with these stories that they are hiding the truth, why are they doing this, why is this, and then at rallies, it kind of encourages them to think that there's a conspiracy against them. And I feel that maybe Trump feels that, and that's why he doesn't believe that he lost the election, because if they did hide those other things, what else are they hiding?
Is there anyone else upstairs who wants to ask a question, by the way, or can we bring the mic down? No, you've already spoken. Can we bring the mic downstairs, because there's loads of people who want to talk here. Who's got the mic? Can we get it over to this gentleman in the white shirt?
I think she's got it.
Oh yeah, sure, yes. Go for it.
A question really for Richard, particularly, but anybody is, do you not think that DeSantis is a contender? Because culturally he seems to be in some ways more in touch with the base, with the Christian base, but perhaps more broadly than Trump is. And he has the advantage of being under 75. So
let's get the mic over here. This lady here, and then the gentleman in the white shirt. I don't mind which order. Both can speak.
Thank you. I am surprised listening to the panel because there seems to be no sympathy for Donald Trump at all, and surely you're seeing, it seems to me, like 40% of the American population in the sentiments that's being expressed. Now, specifically, America does seem to have problems with its, like the mechanisms for conducting its votes. The hanging tribe type of situation. George Bush's brother-in-law was his cousin. You know, like it was a called it first. You know, like at the in the Florida television channel. And my understanding is that Trump's position is that at the end of the voting, like the polls show that he's been successful. Come the next morning, there was a massive controversy about the postal votes. That there's that he believes he's got a prima facie case because the Dennis D'Souza 2000 Mules film provides evidence of irregularities regarding the postal votes paid for by Democratic supporting celebrities. Right, so you can shake your head, right, but the point of fact is that there's an awful lot of people that believe that, right, and that hasn't been examined with any degree to a forensic manner in which, in which the say the Trump case regarding Mar-a-Lago papers are, and that's the type of thing that's going to, I should imagine, fuel a certain amount of resentment. But yeah, so like I said, practically, we're not just sort out what the voting system is, so that there's
I'll make these stats on paper in a sports hall, and then no one will contest anything. That's the system.
That's all chance back to it. But more narrow. I mean, fundamentally, I believe that we get to solve our problems by talking, and we live in a tumultuous time where obviously opinions are very, very high. Now, it's easy to say that we're all in our own echo chamber on social media and whatever else, but the point of fact is, there are those different TV channels, and you kind of go look at them. And my experience with Facebook is falling out people's spectacularly. But the point of fact is, the point being is you have access to alternative points of view. Through that, so the mechanisms are all there, and the panel not have hope that the opportunities and structures exist within America so that people can exchange ideas and that there is hope for the future.
Okay, let's hear from the lady behind you, and then this lady, and then the man.
Hi, thank you. Just very quickly about your point about Kanye West, I agree with you about his mental health problems, terrible. But I think it's naive to think that people like Kanye and Taylor Swift, for instance, don't have huge amounts of influence, because when she tweeted, millions of actually a disenfranchised age group went out and voted for the Democrats. So I think that point is a little bit, I would say, naive. My big point is about abortion, which I don't think actually is a cultural issue. I think it's a medical one, and it affects 50% of the population. And there's a whole swathe of people, particularly in America, where there's that picture of Donald Trump with men behind him signing away abortion rights for women. I actually don't think it's a cultural issue, and I actually think that if you got rid of, I don't think it would have happened, but if the whole of the United States decided to ban abortion, to the gentleman's point over there that it's not a cultural issue, it's not an economic issue, I can tell you that the economy of America would fall through the floor because all the women who are basically working in Amazon and factories and fast food restaurants and looking after your children and your old people are not going to be able to do any of that because they're looking after all the kids they can't afford. And therefore I would like to say, please let's take abortion out of the cultural issue world and start talking about it as a medical issue for 50% of the population, and be meant to step out of that bloody conversation and not talk about it. Thank you.
Well, we're going to have to talk about it because the evangelicals made it an issue. Unfortunately, they've turned it into a cultural issue, even if it is a medical one.
First of all, is that working?
Yeah.
First of all, on celebrities, wrong grading.
Minus 11. Schwarzenegger was a bigger celebrity.
And the second quick question is Tulsi ever finished? Because if I were the Republicans, I'd be thinking, let's get her in, see where this goes. I just wonder whether that's actually a possibility. And the third point is that there's a lot of self-loathing in American politics. It's really irritating to hear. For instance, it happens with the Second Amendment. I agree with the people that say there's something falsehood about the Second Amendment. And also, you get this, whenever you have a sort of shooting going on,
you have this music of, oh, it always happens to us. Only in America do we have this. Actually, we had a bigger school shooting a week and a half ago in Thailand, which of course has much more onerous gun laws. So, but all of the biggest shootings have been in different places: Pakistan, Kenya, France, Vatican, and yet Americans go, it only happens to us because we're so stupid and we have guns. And I think that there's this element of self-loathing, American-centered sort of self-loathing that goes through politics, and I just wondered what people thought of that as a factor.
The best and most evil country in the world, simultaneously. Yeah, let's get some over here. Get a mic. Can we get one mic right up to the front, and then to this lady afterwards?
Hi. So your point about the people shooting schools and how they're an odd nut case, it's not one odd nut case because they're happening almost every week. And as a 16-year-old, I can assure you, school is supposed to be where I learn and where I should be safe. I shouldn't have to go to school with what is essentially a bullet shield in my backpack. So how is it fair that there's a tiny majority of people who are using them for self-defense and then everyone else who is suffering because of it? How is it fair on those who suffer?
Can you pass the mic back to the lady there? And who else wants to ask a question? Can we get the other mic to this gentleman with the glasses? To keep it going forward? Yeah.
I have a question about the deep state. Not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but somebody raised it behind me. Because the fact is, people say, oh, Trump never accepted the result of the election. Hillary Clinton and her supporters have never accepted the result of and then people say, oh, well, he didn't win the popular vote. That's not the system. The system is the Electoral College. And if you disagree with the Electoral College, you have plenty of opportunities to have campaigned against it. But my question is, okay, so Trump disagreed with the electoral result. There are two things. Number one, the way his home was invaded by the FBI, which seems to be acting as a wing of the Democratic Party now, which it's not supposed to do. It's supposed to be, at least in terms of public view, independent. But the other thing is the way the people who protested on January the 6th, let's call it a riot or whatever, and invaded. You can disagree with their tactics, but the fact is there's no evidence that any of them were armed. The only person that died during the protest was a woman who was retired from the military who was shot by a nervous member of the security services. So my question is, I agree that both sides try to delegitimate the other, but it does seem that the state is actively now involved in this process of demonization. And the fact that, Biden Hunter, what's his name? Hunter Biden, that's right, yeah. The fact that Hunter Biden, was never really brought to task over the laptop, all the illegal dealings in terms of contracts he was able to secure as a result of his association with the president. I think we need to ask these questions because these questions have consequences for democracy. And the way I see it, it's not so much that there's going to be a civil war, although I think people in the UK like that idea because they think that we're all gun-toting Americans who are, just ready to shoot it out because they watch too many cowboy films, as do I. But I think what we're seeing is much more of a fragmentation, and there's a desire for the middle ground. Most Republicans support abortion under certain circumstances. Most Democrats support that we should have the right to bear arms, but obviously we all support that people should be vetted. There's a desire for the common ground, but what you're seeing is a fragmentation and a depoliticization, which is really, really dangerous, almost a balkanization politically.
Thank you.
We've got time for a few more questions as long as you keep them nice and short. Let's hear from this gentleman and then let's
Who's Ray Epps?
Did you stand up?
Anyone? Who's Ray Epps? Hello? Anyone?
The presentation is about culture war in America. And I see a big difference between the culture war in America and the culture war in the UK. In America, it seems to me there are two sides, and they're both pushing. In Britain, it seems to me, by contrast, there's only one side pushing, and the other side is rolling over. So we've had 12 years of Conservative government. We have critical race theory in schools, trans ideology in schools. People are being sacked from their jobs, a nurse, a teacher, a railway worker, for ideological reasons. We have people being arrested by the police, thought crime, for misgendering somebody on Twitter, for retweeting a meme, arrested, taken off the police station. It seems to be in the UK, unlike America, and I like what Helen said about some of the school boards pushing back. It seems to me that there are people here in these various meetings today who are pushing back, but in British politics, there is nobody like, say, Ron DeSantis, nobody like Tulsi Gabbard. There's just one side pushing, and the other side, and you mentioned, one of the speakers mentioned Boris. Boris just rolls over. There's no culture war here. There's one side pushing and the other side appeasing.
Kemi Baconoff.
Kemi,
Yeah. Any more questions? Quick ones. Yeah, over there. You spoke in there.
Fine. So, also many things here. Well, there are two things I want to address. First, about COVID. Yes, it mostly only affected or was worse on old people. But when it first came in, nobody knew what it was about, and a lot of people were caught off guard. It did affect a lot of young people, and to this day you have a number of under 30s with the lung capacity of a 70-year chronic smoker. Rare, but yeah, the subsequent variants were far less aggressive, true. But now, on to my other point, abortion. First thing is, abortion is being talked about as an issue that pertains to bodily autonomy. All well and good, but the same people that talk about abortion and bodily autonomy seem to forget bodily autonomy when it comes to enforcing vaccinations. If we're going to enforce one type of bodily autonomy, we have to enforce the other. If we're going to be against the other. It also seems that when we talk about abortion, there seems to be a secret consensus on the definition of women, because people say it's about women's rights. So there is some consensus on the definition of women that involves the capacity or the need to have an abortion. And ultimately, an abortion, we talk about abortion, the right to do it, but I never hear anyone talking about having more access to information, as in, first, access to contraception, making contraception mechanisms more accessible, but also access to information, as in more sex education, especially to the younger layers, educating on what they are going to do that might land them pregnant, but also education on, should you have an abortion, what sort of damage will happen in your body, and damage that can have short, mid, and long-term consequences. So having more information available. I never hear anyone talking about that, just on the abortion in and of itself.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get in one more question, but make it really quick. And please, yeah, there we go.
Okay, really quick. Where do you think the Latino vote will go, bringing it back to the midterms? Because the rumour is that it's going more towards the Republicans, which would make a big difference.
Okay, let's get our panel to sort of sum up, and it'd be great if you could, bring it back to the kind of midterms, to the culture war, rather than is abortion good or bad, or guns good or bad. Helen.
The Latino vote, I think, is really interesting, and I think that what's happened, I don't think actually very much has changed in the Latino vote. I think there's just been a realization that the Democrats dream that democracy is destiny. That if you're a person of color or you're, some kind of identity, minority group, then you're automatically a Democrat. I think that that's now realised that that was a stupid idea, because people are people, and in fact there's quite a lot of, going back to abortion, there are quite a lot of Latino voters who vote in a conservative manner precisely because of abortion. You know, they are Catholic and they have those views, and I think that the Democrats, you know, with Obama, had this idea that the future of America was going to be this rainbow world, which could only possibly vote Democrat, because it would become more and more a rainbow coalition, and it would become more and more democratic, Democrat. Whereas I think now, the African American community votes pretty solidly Democrat. I don't think any other groups do. So I think the Latino vote, it's not like it's becoming more Republican, it's just that it's a bigger section of the vote, and now people realise that on average usually about 35% of Latinos vote Republican. So I think that's where that's going. But it's more that there's been a realisation on that. I really didn't want to give the impression that I'm a kind of flag waver for Biden and you know, didn't understand some of the things about Trump. I think the difficulty is that we look at Britain and we think you had this wonderful expression of freedom and populism in Brexit, and that was just a beautiful thing, and we got Trump, you know, which was not quite so beautiful. And I think the point about Trump, which is why I think he is an important person and why it's quite difficult to see who would replace him, is that he basically recognised that the high degree of alienation and distrust that existed amongst working class men in America, and I think that he you know, basically forged that coalition and forced that agenda, forced those people to be kind of put back on the agenda and to be heard. And I think that, and that's one of the reasons why you know, he was so successful, was that he was able to kind of do that. I think the problem with that though is that that's why his particular voting bloc is so distrustful. It isn't that like everybody, you know, it's an accident that all of his voters think that he was, you know, fiddled out of the vote and there was fraud. That's where they're coming from. It's a level of distrust in the system, a level of distrust that, you know, just is quite profound. And I think that increasingly, you know, now we recognise that there is this very large minority of about 30% of Americans who feel very unheard. And DeSantis, you know, will he be able to pick those up? I don't know, we're meant to wind up. So Trump is also great for the news business. Every time he says something, you sell a story. So I love him on that front.
Basically, bullied our panel into being nice about Trump. Richard, your final thoughts?
Yeah, so just on Trump, I guess, important. I think that he, in 2016, made important critiques about the Democratic Party's embrace of globalization and a certain economic model that had clearly failed broad areas of the country. And I think that you see that the Biden administration has quietly accepted certain parts of that critique, particularly with the Biden Made in America push, Biden's cheating on trade, Biden's hawkishness on China, and so on. The Biden administration doesn't trumpet it as much, but I think that that's a legacy of an important, I think, positive contribution that Trump made. He exposed a terrible neglect of the Democratic Party of key electorate. The attempt to bring down Trump through a sort of semi-legal process over the last several years, I think, has also been a mistake of Democrats. I think that the impeachment attempts were a distraction, and they were never going to succeed. And enormous amounts of energy were expended on them, and really Democrats should have been building a political alternative and objection to Trump. And I think in some ways this latest investigation risks again being another distraction a sideshow from the Democrats actually being able to build an alternative political message. That all being said, I don't accept the comment that Hillary Clinton didn't accept that she lost the 2016 election. She didn't like that she lost it, and she did sort of make comments about Russia and so on. But she did concede the election. She did go to his inauguration. And I think that Trump's behavior after 2020, first of all, was not necessary. Trump did not need to do that. Right? I think he could have been a very credible candidate for the next election without having to go down any of that line. In some ways, I think it's weakened him politically. And I do think that people like DeSantis pose a threat to him. I think he's still the front runner for the nomination. But I don't think that he needed to do any of that. And I think it was a terrible mistake.
Thanks. Yaron.
So let me just clarify. I am very opposed to Trump. I've been opposed to Trump from 2015 on. The fact that he didn't concede the election wasn't surprising at all. He told us he wouldn't concede it in advance. He is the worst thing to happen in American politics, maybe ever. He has destroyed the Republican Party as a credible alternative to the Democrats. I'm almost as anti-Biden and Hillary Clinton as I am anti-Trump. So it's not like I'm for these others because I'm anti-Trump. I am for an alternative to both. I disagree with my fellow panelist here because I think that what Biden has done is took the worst of Trump's policies and doubled up on them. Globalization was one of the greatest things that's ever happened to the Western world. We have benefited massively from globalization, and I know this is an unpopular view today, both on left and right, but we've all are far better off because of globalization, and the move away from globalization is one that we are going to regret for a very long time. So it's not that I am ignoring 40% of the population who support Trump. I'm ignoring 90% of the population who support Trump and the people who support Biden. I think they're all wrong. And this is the point I was trying to make, and I'll end with this because we're running out of time. Ultimately, the fundamental question for America is it the land of the Declaration of Independence? Is it about individualism? Is it about liberty? Is it about freedom? And there is no political voice today for that perspective. The left and the right are the same when it comes to their collectivistic view of what America is about. It's all about tribes, it's all about groups, it's all about identity politics. I agree completely, whether it's white or alternative. And there is no voice today for the core ideas that made America what it is today. And in that sense, America will suffer economically as it devolves away from the land of entrepreneurs and the land of individualism.
All right, so I'm going to just briefly touch on Trump. I'm not just like Trump-hating, Biden-loving, whatever. I almost voted for Trump. The reason I didn't was because I thought Biden would be a lot more unifying. He hasn't been, so there we go. I like to think of Trump as a chemo. He saw the political establishment, saw the Clintons, saw the Bushes, he saw the media establishment, and he wanted to rebuke that, and he did. But now we need him gone because he is too toxic, and that's another reason I voted for Biden. He's too toxic. He makes every debate just about him and about hating the other side. Just because you don't believe the election was stolen doesn't mean you are ignoring half the country. More Republicans voted for Trump than more people voted for Trump than any other Republican candidate. That's impressive. His support among the Republicans at the time of the election was 90%, which is even good for an incumbent. But now it's about 40%. So his support among Republicans is half since the election because of his bogusness. All right, and then now to my conclusion. So we mentioned this up here. There are these two sides, progressive Democrats and the Trump Republicans, and both of them are responding to globalization and to failed foreign wars. And those are two issues that I can sympathize with. There's a lot of manufacturing jobs that have been sent overseas, a lot of populations that have been overlooked. And the progressives and the Trump Republicans are both trying to tap into this population. And I think it's important to address them. And you see this Democrat Party, which was a majority of minorities in 2012, and you see it becoming a lot whiter, a lot more urban, a lot more educated. And now the most likely demographic to be a swing voter is a non-college educated, non-white voter. So that's why I have some hope in the parties. In their current state, I don't like it. But I believe that they both have to adjust to the fact that Republicans are becoming more diverse and Democrats are becoming less diverse. And the parties will have to adjust to try to get back that central voter. Thanks.
And before we give the much needed round of applause, I just want to get in an announcement. Join us now, which is after this, for the drinks receptions at 55 Broadway, which is above St James's Park Underground Station. So I hope to see you all there. Let's give our panel a huge round of applause.